supposed to be a class about science and creation. Now, basically, the big goal of this is to give Christians a stronger belief in the Bible and non-Christians something to think about. And first and foremost, I do want to admit that I do have a bias. I believe the Bible is the inerrant Word of God. And basically, it should be the guide for all other information brought for review. One of the things I should do in the start is go over a few different words and how I may define them, which are pretty important to a lot of this stuff. One of the first things I want to talk about is proof. Because people want to prove whether something is true or false, but something like that is not really always possible. We cannot always put an idea or a theory underneath a microscope. Certain things like God can't be scientifically proven to exist. And so basically, if you can't prove it, then how can you determine what might be more correct for any certain things? Well, we can think about how things were with Sherlock Holmes. I'm pretty sure you've heard of him. He basically was a detective written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and he was able to figure out or glean the facts from just a few pieces of information, or weeding out the truth from a pile of false information. Sorry, get my words twisted up there. So how did he do it? Well, one of the things that Sherlock Holmes was said to say was, once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. So the question would be, is how does that relate to us? And basically what it means is, if you're following a line of thinking that is based on a series of events to occur, and we find that the events at the start can't happen, then the entire line of events could easily fall apart as a valid answer. Quite simply, if you can't get off the starting line, there's no way you're going to finish the race. So that may come in handy as we review some of the evidence for evolution and for creation. Another one is time. In evolutionary theories, time is used as a hero of the story. It's a rescue device, as science frequently says that given enough time, anything can happen. Is that really true? I mean, it sounds like it could be, but we may find out that it does not really happen that way, or in the way they may expect. You may find that there's some things, it doesn't matter how much time you give it, it can't happen. So we'll take a look at that. Evidence. Now, science, it's all about evidence. They want to have evidence for things. People want evidence for things. I mean, that's how they prove what's right or wrong, right? So, evolutionists believe that they have a lot of evidence to prove that evolution is true. But what about creation? Do they have any evidence? Believe it or not, they have as much evidence as evolution, maybe even a little bit more. Why? Because evidence doesn't belong to any one side or the other. Evidence doesn't really speak. Evidence is interpreted based on the observer's worldview. So it's really up to us to review the interpretation of the evidence to see what fits better. So we're not looking at the evidence itself to give us the information. It's the interpretation of the evidence that really makes a big difference. Now, what about science? Science, in short, is basically knowledge. It's learning. It's a pursuit of understanding of what is seen and what is not seen. Science can also give us a framework to allow a person to create ideas, test them, and figure out what may or may not work. I mean, many consider there to be two primary branches for science: operational science and historical science. Operational science is the experimental science done in the lab or the field. It does investigate repeatable events in the present. And this concerns mostly physics, chemistry, biology, as well as observational geology, astronomy, and so on. And quite simply, it is what allows us to develop medicines, better cars, mind blank, but better rockets, you name it. I mean, medicine, I said medicines tonight, electronics. There's a lot of different things we do just because we can test it, find what works better, and use it. Now, historical science is concerned about extrapolating from the present observations to distant, unobserved, and really unrepeatable past. This includes various theories and explanations about archaeology, cosmology, historical geology, paleontology, biological evolutionary development, and so on. So operational science is rarely questioned, though, by either creationists or evolutionists, because both sides work with operational science. They do tests, they do experiments, they get results, and they're able to repeat them. That's standard on either side. It's the historical science, though, that has caused much more concern, because it's the viewpoint of the observer and their worldview that determines how the evidence is interpreted. So, start this off. Let's go ahead and take a look at a video here.
Have you ever heard this? Billions of years ago, there was an explosion in space. Or 100,000 years ago, this happened or that happened. Or even, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Question, how does anyone know? I mean, was anybody there to observe it? Well, actually somebody was, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Check this out. First of all, we need to recognize that there is a huge difference between observational science and historical science. Both are valuable, but very different. Let's define the two real quick, shall we? Observational science is simply when we observe something and experiment to draw conclusions. It involves repeatable experimentation and observations in the present. It's through observational science that we find cures for diseases and build space shuttles, stuff like that. Now, through historical science, we consider things that happened in the past, but they cannot be checked in the same way. I mean, we don't have access to the past like we do the present because, well, it's gone, right? All we really have is speculation, or at best, circumstantial evidences of past events based on what we see in the present. That's not to say that we can't make intelligent guesses about the past, or form reasonable inferences from rocks or fossils in the present, but we certainly cannot directly test our conclusions because we cannot repeat the past. Got it? So, does that mean historical science is unimportant? Not at all. Let's drop an example down here for a minute and take a look at the Eiffel Tower. You know, that 19th century Parisian monument designed by Gustave Eiffel that stands 1,063 feet tall, which was built as the entrance for the 1889 World's Fair and is still the tallest building in Paris today, visited by millions of people each year? Yeah, that one. Well, guess what? Everything I just told you is true, but how do we test it? Well, applying observational science, we can, of course, observe the Eiffel Tower anytime we're in Paris. It's here in the present. Then, we can continue by testing the height and comparing it to all the other structures in Paris and confirm the claim that it is indeed the tallest building in Paris. But that's the extent of the kind of facts that can be proved by observational science in reference to this claim. How do we really know that Gustave designed it? How do we really know it was built in the 19th century as an entrance to the 1889 World's Fair? How do we really know how many people visited? That's all in the past. It can't be repeated. For that kind of information, we need to go outside the limits of observational science and discover what has been communicated to us through historical documents and eyewitness accounts. And furthermore, we have to believe those eyewitnesses and documents are trustworthy. The same is true when we talk about the origin of the Earth. The Earth is here. We all agree with that. So, does observational science confirm that the world was created by God? And are there trustworthy documents and eyewitness accounts that confirm it? Well, let's take the last part first. In short, what we're really asking is my original question: was anybody there to observe it? The answer is yes. God was there, and He told us how He created. He inspired people to write down His very words that became books that were compiled into a complete book called the Bible, which has been verified over and over again and has demonstrated itself to be totally trustworthy in all it claims and teaches. Even secular scholars will concede that the Bible accurately records historical events. Anyway, we have the most trustworthy revelation from the most trustworthy eyewitness. Now, what about observational science? Does it confirm the Bible? Yes. And what's extremely important to realize is the observable fact that the universe is logical and orderly. That makes sense only if its creator is logical and has imposed order on his creation. It doesn't make sense at all if the universe is just an accident of a huge explosion. Also, our minds are able to comprehend many things about the universe, and that's only possible if the creator of the mind gave us the ability and desire to explore the universe. It doesn't make sense if our brains are byproducts of chance because we couldn't trust their conclusions to ever be accurate. And lastly, it only makes sense that we can observe and repeat an experiment if the universe consistently obeys the same laws from day to day, which only makes sense if a lawgiver created it that way and upholds it. So to be bluntly honest, science itself, whether observational or historical, is only possible because God exists and the Bible is true. I could go on, but enough said.
So basically, that's one of the things I will be doing in these series, is I will be showing a bunch of videos as well, mostly because I do not try to say that I know all of this information. I have studied a lot of it, but it certainly does not make me a master of it. These people that I'll be showing these different videos are people who have spent many, many years studying their fields. And so, quite simply, they will know a lot more about it and will be able to explain it much better than I could. The big part I'm doing is getting these different videos together to help support the information that they have already shown. Now, admittedly, the majority of these classes will be from the creationist view, because that is the bias I have, that is my worldview. I do believe in creation. But anyhow, this first class will be from the evolutionary view. This viewpoint is what's taught in schools and in the mainstream media. So let me ask some of these things. Let me ask you this. Who here has been taught about abiogenesis? And who knows what it is? Because abiogenesis is basically something that's been, it was taught, I'm sorry, I lost my spot. Let's see, basically abiogenesis is the creation of life from non-life. It is basically saying, going from a non-living entity to a living entity. So that it makes it so that it is the one point of time we go from having just simple molecules, dust, dirt, hydrogen, helium, carbon, you name it. Having all of that and going from it just sitting around in piles and pools and to actually having something that has life. That's abiogenesis. I may not be defining it quite correctly, but the thing is there. Greetings, I read stuff. Thank you for joining us. I hope we don't get you too bored. We're going to have some fun looking at a bunch of different videos and talking about science and creation. Now, the thing I want to say is there's a lot of things taught in scientific evolutionary history. As some people have brought up in some of the different Discord groups, they've talked about the Big Bang. I personally am not planning on talking about the Big Bang because, to me, that doesn't matter at this point of time. When it comes to life, no matter what is taught, no matter how long of a history we have, all life has to start from somewhere. With the Bible, life started with God giving life to us. With evolution, life started from dirt, or as they would say, star stuff, or stardust. And it all comes down to this one point of time of abiogenesis, the time when life, or when non-life, became life. And that's basically the part we're going to look at first and foremost, because that really is the important part. It's the beginning of the story. If you can't get the beginning of the story, it doesn't matter what you have afterwards. There's nothing to support it. So you've got to have that beginning set. You got to have something, because otherwise, it's just a story. Now, the other thing is I try to not just exclude one side or the other just because of my belief. I try to be fair with the information. I let them try to show me a support. But by the same token, I am not going to just say, okay, I'm a Christian. I've got to exclude anything that says it's of evolution. No, I can't do that. No, I have to be fair. By the same token, when I was believing in evolution, I could not just throw out everything from the Bible just because I was told a bunch of stories, especially if the part I'm looking at doesn't really support itself. So, let's take a look at the abiogenesis and what science has had to say about it. What we're going to do is take a look at another video, and this one was from Mr. Ben Stein in his movie from Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. It's actually it's a portion of the video used from Cosmic Origins. And that was actually done in, let's see, when was Cosmic Origins done? I think it's done in 1997, I think it was. I'll have to double check that. Let's see if I can get that to play.
Have you ever heard this?
How does Darwin or Darwinism say life began?
Well, he didn't know, and in fact, nobody knows. So Darwinism, strictly defined, starts after the origin of life and deals only with living things.
Well, how can there be a theory about life without a theory about how life began?
Well, a grand overarching evolutionary story, of course, does include the origin of life, but Darwin's theory doesn't begin until you have the first cell.
Well, does someone have a theory about how life began?
This is the story of a small planet in space called Earth.
For a typical Darwinian explanation of how life originated, Dr. Wells directed me toward this documentary.
The chemical elements essential for life, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen, were now in place. What was needed was a way of combining them. Perhaps the energy came from lightning. Whatever it was.
Excuse me?
Whatever it was, energy managed to arrange these chemical ingredients in just the right way.
Whatever it was? I was hoping for something a little more scientific. The most popular idea has been that life emerged spontaneously from primordial soup. In 1953, Stanley Miller mixed water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen to simulate the early Earth's atmosphere. Then he ran electricity through it in an attempt to jumpstart life.
It's alive! It's alive!
It didn't work. While the initial results seemed promising, 50 years later, most serious scientists have abandoned this approach in favor of alternate theories.
Einstein did bring up a pretty good point of the same of whatever it was. That's not really that good of an answer, I would think, as to saying how life started from abiogenesis. Well, don't forget, this one was from a pretty long time ago. And science has done a lot of work over the last, 50 years? So, let's go ahead and keep moving on. And as you saw from, let's see. Yeah, we're going to watch the next movie, which is How Life Begins, Origins Nova. And this one was done in 2004. So we can see if they have done any better.
So how did life begin? Well, over the years, people have come up with some pretty creative answers to this question.
Yeah, this is not
one of my favorites comes from a 17th century scientist who wrote down a recipe for creating life from scratch. Let's see. It says here, take a dirty garment, place it in a vessel. Next, add wheat.
There we go.
Then, according to the recipe, after fermenting for 21 days, mice will appear, fully formed. Of course, we all know that life doesn't form this way. But at some point in Earth's early years, life did emerge out of non-living ingredients. And for clues to the real recipe of life, we have to go back some 4 billion years to a time when Earth was nothing like the planet we know today. But where did the very first life come from? For more
Now, one of the things you will be noticing as I go through these videos, I have edited them down quite a bit to mainly the parts that are talking about abiogenesis. So extra parts, I cut them out just so I can save time. I have the links and so on for the actual videos if you wish to have them to review the whole video. I've got no problems with that. Because as we go through this information, the big thing I also want to let you know is I am not here to tell you what to think. I'm not here to tell you what you should believe. This here is nothing more than a class to help you have information so you can make a much better choice, to have better determination. So let's keep going with this. If you have any questions or anything, please put something in the chat and I'll try to make sure I answer it as quickly as I can.
than a century, scientists have known that life is the result of chemistry, the combination of just the right ingredients in just the right amounts. Today we know these ingredients aren't things like dirty garments and wheat, which people used to think would spontaneously generate mice. Ingredients of life are actually much simpler. All living things, from bacteria to mice to you and me, are made from a small set of chemical elements. Hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, 4 of the most common elements in the universe. Combined in just the right way, these are the fundamental ingredients of life. And carbon is the star of the show.
Carbon's everywhere. It's all over the universe.
What makes carbon special is the kind of bonds that it makes, both with itself and with other elements.
We know of no other atom that has the flexibility that carbon has to form diverse types of compounds.
And the idea that life could have started when carbon and other ingredients combined in the harsh conditions of early Earth was first put to the test in the 1950s by a young graduate student named Stanley Miller. To simulate the newborn Earth in the lab, Miller assembled a contraption made out of flasks and tubes. He filled one flask with gases thought at the time to represent Earth's primitive atmosphere. And he connected that to another flask with water to represent the oceans.
And then he did a brilliant thing. He simply put an electric charge through that to essentially simulate lightning going through an early atmosphere. And after sitting around for a couple of days, all of a sudden there was all this brown goo all over the reaction vessel. And when he analyzed what was in the vessel, now he actually had amino acids.
Amino acids are compounds that form when molecules of carbon and other elements link together. They are the essential building blocks of proteins and cells, vital ingredients of all living things.
We went from our initial small compounds, and here's an example of one of them, simple amino acid, and we used the energy associated with the impact to build larger molecules. Molecules like this. This is a peptide, and we showed that we could use the impact energy to grow larger molecules from the simplest building blocks of life.
Peptides link together to form larger building blocks, proteins, which make up all the cells in our bodies. But the leap from non-living ingredients to a living creature, complete with DNA which allows cells to replicate, is staggeringly complex. No one knows how this process started or what course it took.
It is.
So, as you just heard there, no one knows how it started or in what way it did, and what course it took, as he said. So that right there is kind of similar to what we saw from the first one. But let's see if he has anything else to say.
Hard to really get your head around the great leap from non-living to living.
Well, it's hard enough that nobody's succeeded in doing it in the laboratory.
I think it's an astonishing mystery and one that we truly don't understand in any great detail.
While we don't yet know how the spark of life occurred, we can try to figure out where it might have gotten a foothold.
Okay. So as we saw, they don't know how it started. They don't know the pathway it took. And in labs, they still didn't do any, they had no experiment that made it work. Oops. There we go. So, as I said, there's some issues with the experiment. When they used the Miller-Urey experiment as part of their proof as well. And like I said, there are some issues with that, but I'm not intending on getting into those. It's not necessary. And as I've said before, this is just a review of the of what evolutionary sciences have said about how life started. Because that's really what we want to know. How did it start? How did they say it started? What's their evidence? What's their information? So Nova didn't seem to have the answer as of yet. So let's go ahead and move on to something more recent and see if anything has changed. Because like I said, science is constantly changing. If you doubt that, consider how often schools have to update their science books. Usually once every several years, because everything's changed. And yes, you're correct, Denziva. Amino acids are not even living. Amino acids are so low on the building block. It's like getting mud and straw together, having it form something of a brick-like thing when it dries out in the sun, and saying, oh, we now have the Empire State Building. No. So, let's move on to something a little bit more recent and see if anything has changed. We're going to take a look at the video, The Story of Earth, that was from National Geographic in 2011. Hopefully, they've got some more information.
This must be a mirage. A city of underwater chimneys. It's not smoke. It's some kind of hot liquid. Seawater has seeped down into the earth through cracks in the crust, getting hotter, collecting minerals and gases on the way. It's this potent mixture that's spewing back out into the ocean, building these towers. Add to this all those minerals and chemicals from the meteorites, and the water has become a chemical soup. It's impossible to know how or when, but somehow these chemicals have come together to create life. The water is now full of microscopic organisms. These single-celled bacteria are the earliest forms of life on Earth. This is a defining moment in the making of the planet. Microscopic life is underway.
Oh, it's impossible to know how or when the life started. It's such a defining moment, as I say, something that's so important. And they don't know how it happened. They've got no clue still. I mean, as you saw, they did say at least, well, it must have started down in the water. Deep ocean vents. Thermal vents at that. And by the way, when it comes to thermal vents, there's two different types. There's the black smokers and the white smokers. We'll learn more about those at a different time if needed. But they do make a difference as to which ones could or could not actually have the ability to actually create life. Because we'll find out that they do have some other issues. Yes, I'm messing around the video at the same time, so I'm trying to get it resized. I'll try to be better for the next time for this. But yep, scientists are still doing their research. And as this time, though, since science still hasn't shown us any idea of how life started, no tests or anything that can show anything, there's very little evidence to support that what we're taught is a fact. I mean, we have been taught that evolution is a fact, right? Right? So, if what they're saying is a fact and there's no evidence yet, really no proof, that's not much of a fact, is there? So, what we're going to do, since they have learned a lot since 2018, we're going to look at a couple more videos that were released in 2018 that were released by, let's see, who were they released by? Well, let's see, I can't see the exact name of who was the main group that released them, other than to say that they were released in 2018, and they were actually several videos that covered the different parts of origin and the development of life. And since these videos actually refer to each other as they go through, and it appears that they're supposed to be taken together as a set, we can look at two of them, because there's actually three. Like I've said before, I have all the links for all these videos. So instead of just looking at the cut down versions I have, you can get or look at the full size video if you wish, so you can see what other information they have. The big part to remember, though, is it doesn't matter how good the story is. If they don't have any beginning, that's not much of a story, is it? I mean, you got to have a good, solid foundation to start anything you do, life included. So, as I said, we're going to look at two of them. So, let's see. This first one, the physics of life. Ooh, physics.
Disorder and chaos. So, how did it generate the extreme complexity we see in life? Actually, the laws of physics themselves may demand it. To understand life, we need to understand entropy. The universe tends toward disorder, decay, and equilibrium. A hot cup of coffee will tend towards the same temperature as the room, and the hot, dense early universe must expand. Stars always burn out, black holes evaporate. The particles that make up any system all have some degree of random motion. That random motion tends to drive the system towards the most common arrangement of particles. Such a random, disordered, unspecial arrangement is a high entropy state. Interesting arrangements like thermal energy being concentrated in your cup of coffee or all the matter in the observable universe being crunched into an infinitely dense point are low entropy. They're highly specific configurations that almost never happen by chance. So entropy is sort of a measure of the boringness of a system, the commonness of the arrangement of particles. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that a closed system will only increase in entropy. The universe will only get more boring. But there's one type of system that seems to resist the second law of thermodynamics and maintain low entropy. That system is life. Life has very low internal entropy because its structure is extremely specific and non-random. The molecular machinery of even a single cell defies belief. You know what? I'd prefer to let a real biologist convince you. Hey Joe, tell them how it is.
Cells are complex. Okay, that's a massive understatement. Inside just a single one of your cells, you have 6 billion base pairs of DNA, storing hundreds of megabytes of data.
Okay, if you take a look at the cell that he's showing there, this is one little bit of interesting information that I found kind of humorous. The cell on this screen is a red blood cell. And there's a problem with this, because he's talking about containing DNA, but this red blood cell, which happens to be an adult red blood cell, has no DNA. It may have started with having some DNA when it's first being created inside the bone marrow, in the marrow of your bone, but once it was released, that DNA was gone. This cell was generally created to be nothing more than a tool for the transfer of oxygen as well as waste products in and out of the system. So this is not really a very good example for DNA, is it? Where is it? There we go.
Intricate molecular machinery made of RNA and protein unpacks, transcribes, cuts and splices, and processes that data to build and control an entire factory of protein molecular machines, which in turn power the entire biological process that is you. Easy, right?
Naively, this preservation and increase in order appears to contradict the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy appears to either stay constant or decrease. The Earth's biosphere, at least, becomes less boring over time. But let me be clear. There is no violation of the second law. The second law tells us that closed systems must increase in entropy, so systems unable to exchange energy with the outside environment. But living organisms, and indeed the Earth's biosphere, are not closed. Both receive energy from outside. Ultimately, that source of energy is the sun. Its light warms the atmosphere and the oceans, and it powers photosynthesis at the bottom of the food chain, driving a complex chain of nutrient synthesis that ends with whatever you had for dinner last night. Another way to say this is that life feeds on energy gradients. When two systems with very different energy densities come into contact, energy must flow. Life feeds on that flow. In fact, the importance of energy gradients to life can help us understand the actual origin of life and its precursors. The origin of life on Earth isn't known. We think it started with a self-replicating molecule similar to RNA. The companion episode over on It's Okay to Be Smart will get into the nitty-gritty of that. Following that synthesis, evolution took hold, and the first protocell and then first true living cell pulled itself together. These systems are doing their best to obey the second law of thermodynamics by redistributing their energy as evenly and randomly as they can. Heat energy flows from hot to cold, seeking a uniform temperature. But energy is also dispersed into every form it can take, consistent with the laws of physics. Some of that energy gets distributed into chemical bonds, as simple molecules form via every chemical reaction that's possible given the available raw materials. As those molecules form, new channels open up for distributing energy into the chemical bonds of increasingly complex molecules. Normally, this local rise in complexity would all cease when the system reaches thermal equilibrium. Energy is perfectly evenly distributed, and new molecules break apart exactly as often as they're formed. But when our energy source is flowing into a much larger reservoir, like the ocean for example, then equilibrium is never reached. Complexity can increase indefinitely as a byproduct of the system striving to redistribute the endless gradient in energy. And at some point, natural selection takes over. Molecules self-catalyze. They help drive the very reactions that create more of the same. Molecules better at that process become more abundant, And at some point they become true self-replicators, and eventually they become life. But even life and self-replication might be a very natural part of the same thermodynamic drive to dissipate energy. I mean, think about it. Living things are incredible heat dissipation, entropy maximizing machines.
Hey guys, Joe here. Some people...
Where to start for this one? This one, as you can see, approached evolution, or abiogenesis even, from a completely different view. By the fact it's trying to say, well, we've been looking at the chemical side, we haven't seen much, let's go to physics. Does that actually work? I do want you to remember what he said in the beginning about the second law of thermodynamics and how everything must degrade, entropy. And he's trying to say there's a difference between closed systems and open systems. Sounds good, doesn't it? But remember that he called life an open system. Because the question is, do the others agree with that? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. And the question is also this thing of it's expected of physics, through physics, that life should emerge, it should evolve to higher and higher complexity. I'm not so certain I believe that really could happen, because you're talking about the need of a lot of energy, a lot, just to create something, to use energy. And consider, how much energy is used to make a car? Just make it. You get all that electricity, fuel, all the different plastics, metals to be smelted down, to be created and combined, and to get it screwed together, to get all the different tools, the instruments, the computers as they use to weld it together, screw it together, bolt it together, and so on. Finally get to roll off the assembly line. You finally get a car. All the energy has been put into it. Is that car going to start using energy? No. It just rolled off the assembly line. You use a ton of energy, and it's doing nothing but, right off the bat, degrading. That doesn't sound like it's very productive, does it? So, as the narrator says, physics may demand life. So now instead of time and chance, it's time and entropy? I don't think so. And he was asking about being an adult cell. I do not mean when I say adult cell as in the cell of an adult human. I do mean that as being an adult cell as in when the cell is forming inside the marrow of the bone, it's considered like a juvenile cell. It's being formed. And until that process is done and it's released into the bloodstream, once it gets released in the bloodstream, then it becomes an adult blood cell. So it's just a stasis of the blood cell itself, not the person. So I just want to make sure I'm clear about that. It's not saying there's a difference in the cells between an adult and a baby. They're not going to have like different blood cells in that respect. So, and that, oh yeah, that's the other thing I want to say. Is the red blood cells, they don't split to reproduce. They don't have the DNA. They're basically tools. They can't repair themselves. They are used until they fall apart, they break down, and then the body just takes them, throws them away. They're done and makes new ones. So, like I was saying before, the narrator explained how life is not a closed system. Greetings, Bobby. Nice to see you. Welcome to the chat. Welcome to the stream. Hopefully, this won't be too crazy or boring for you. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. And if you want to know the sources of the videos, I will gladly share those too. I'll find a way to get the paper I have with all the links given out. So let's see. The narrator says the origin of life isn't known, other than he says that we think that it started with a self-replicating molecule. And the next video is supposed to give us more information about that. Do we have any idea of what it takes to make a self-replicating molecule? And to be able to do it effectively to where it can increase rather than decrease? I don't know. I don't think so. And the other thing is he's talking about how life before was not a closed system. So wouldn't that mean the chemical reactions, as they would call physics in this respect, is meaning that we are still not at life because it's not living, but then they're expected to be able to increase in complexity? Is that really going with entropy or against entropy? I guess we'll see, won't we? But something to think about. Because you have to define, if they're going to say that life is not a closed system, they might need to define what life is, if they can. So they know when to say life can work and life can actually start pulling in extra energy to survive, to increase. So let's see. So the explanation of entropy driving towards more and more complex molecules and eventually to life sounds good too, doesn't it? But does it work in the lab? Who made this video? Is it for public schools? This video, I will release all of that information a little bit later. I have a sheet of all this information. This one was, let's see, do I have that put down here? Let me pull up the video sheet I have. And let's see, video links. Okay, that's creation. There is the evolution. That was the physics of life. Was that one? And the next one, I believe, is the where did life come from? And I have the links. I will share them with you guys. I don't know. Am I able to send a file in here? No. So it looks like I cannot just give you the file from here. Nope. Like I said, I'll have to give you guys the PDF file I have a little bit later on, okay? Because I got a whole couple of sheets of all the information. I'd rather not just do them one by one at this time. But trust me, I will get you the information. Because that's the big things. I want to make sure as we go through this information, you have a chance to look at all of it if you wish. So you guys can make your own decisions. So you can see if what I am saying or trying to look at makes sense or not. Because one of the big things is as I've looked through these different videos over the years, I've studied and looked at these things, is very often we can easily be blinded by the story and completely miss the science that's actually in it when it comes to this. Because as we've seen so far from most of these videos, what they have said for what abiogenesis is, how does it happen, they still have no clue. And that to me is extremely important. Because how can you call something fact, say it's absolutely, positively, 100% the way things are, if you don't even know how it started, how it even works? It just doesn't work. It's not a fact that way. It just isn't. When you take that to court, say, I'm absolutely positively certain that the moon is made out of cheese. Can you prove it? It's made out of cheese. Well, fact is that we've actually got rocks. They're not very edible. It's definitely not cheese. So, let's see, where was I in this? Yeah, there was also, as he's saying, it sounded pretty good the way he's saying the complex molecules would keep going together to make life. I mean, does it work in the lab? So far, no, it has not. We'll look at more information about that later. There's also the question of how the more complex molecules would stay together long enough to be used again. Because don't forget, the big thing they're looking at, the Hughes reservoir that they're talking about, is a large body of water. That's where they're getting the thermal gradient. Water is cooler than the sun that's hitting it. There's your thermal gradient. There's also the problem of what water does, because water has a very good ability to tear down complex organic molecules. Now, organic molecules, just so you know, are basically carbon-based molecules. So it doesn't mean it's plant or animal life. It just means it has carbon in it. So that's another little bit of difference when we say organic molecule. It's a carbon molecule. Okay? So considering all that he said, the origin of life still isn't known, then this would make the explanation of entropy driving more complex molecules in the ocean to be nothing more than just a conjecture or a hypothesis. Because again, you've got to be able to test this to say, yeah, this definitely works. If you're not having a test, you have no way to see it, show it, you're just giving up some ideas, and that's it. So it seems to be pretty much a familiar statement from all these videos so far we've watched. All of them from 20 years ago to current, or recent, I should say, have said that they don't know how life has started. Now, this narrator did say that the next video is to give us information about self-replicating molecules. So, let's go ahead and take a look at this guy and see what this video can teach us about abiogenesis. Okay? And this is, where did life come from?
People would argue the most important year in the history of soup was 1962, when Andy Warhol released his super soupy pop art. But I think soup's best year came a decade earlier in 1952, when a scientist named Stanley Miller first cooked up primordial soup. Miller's experiment took some simple chemicals like those found on early Earth, bubbled them up through a tube, zapped them with electricity, and after a few days floating in this soup, he found amino acids, the building blocks of proteins and one of the essential ingredients for life. This idea that life's origins could be found in a puddle of chemicals is an old one. In the 1920s, two different scientists theorized about life coming from what they called a prebiotic soup. And this soupy speculation even goes back, unsurprisingly, to Charles Darwin, who in 1871 wondered if life may have formed from chemicals in some warm little pond. What made Miller's experiment so special was it gave us proof. Regular non-life stuff could become cool life stuff super easily. But every living thing we see today, even the most basic bacteria, is so complex, built of such intricate machinery, it's impossible to imagine they just popped into existence out of some soup. That's because they didn't. We're gonna go on a journey in search of the origin of life, and along the way there will be a few forks in the road, maybe a couple speed bumps, and we're gonna need help from a couple friends. We'll come to see that Miller's primordial soup isn't exactly how this story began. But the first question we should ask isn't how life started, it's when.
Life on Earth couldn't exist before Earth existed, and it formed.
So they're saying it's not important to know how, but when. All right, let's see what they can say about that.
Around 4.5 billion years ago at the dawn of the Hadean Eon. Soon after that, another planet collided with the young Earth, melted the entire crust, and created the moon in the process. After the crust cooled, there was even some liquid water, at least for a little while. Because for the next couple 100 million years, Earth was showered with hundreds of massive space rocks. The oceans boiled away, the crust melted again, and Earth was basically no place for life until things settled down about 4 billion years ago at the dawn of the Archean Eon.
This is the earliest possible time that life could have started on Earth, the beginning of what we call the habitability boundary. And fossil and chemical evidence tell us that early microbes existed by 3.7 billion years ago, what's known as the biosignature boundary. At some moment in here, non-life became life. We call this abiogenesis. I don't have a time machine. As far as I know, no one does. Therefore, we can't go back and find that exact moment. But if we could, what would we look for? This brings us to the next big question on this journey. What is life? You'd think biology would have a good definition for life, the thing it studies. But as a biologist, I can tell you this is much harder than it sounds. In one chapter of biologist J.B.S. Haldane's 1949 book, What is Life?, he literally writes, I am not going to answer this question. Life is a board game, a delicious breakfast cereal, and a highway? According to the dictionary, it's the time between birth and death. But none of these definitions really help us. I think we might be asking the wrong question, because life isn't a thing that things have. Life is what living things do. In school, many people learn a checklist for the characteristics a thing must have in order to be alive. Mrs. Gren. But this list came from looking at life as we know it today. Life at the very beginning was probably much simpler. A cat-loving physicist, Erwin Schrödinger, looked at all these things that life does and saw something only a physicist would see.
In 1944, Schrödinger defined life as a struggle against entropy, the persistent resistance of decay, the preservation of disequilibrium. Since then, we've learned a lot more about entropy, and it may be that the rise of complexity is as inevitable as its decay.
That sounds pretty good. Life creates these little closed systems where it works to keep things nice and ordered. But this definition still leaves out one important thing. Living things evolve. What we're describing is evolution by natural selection, Darwin's famous idea. And for life to move forward, it must have been there from the beginning. Life is a product of evolution. With all this in mind, maybe we're finally able to come up with a better definition. Life began the moment that molecules of information started to reproduce and evolve by natural selection. And now that we have a definition, and it's a mouthful, we can make some rules for what something has to do to be alive. Here they are. A living thing must work to avoid decay and disorder. To do that, a living thing has to create a closed system or be made of cells. They have some molecule that can carry information about how to build cell machinery. And this information must evolve by natural selection. Sounds pretty good, but rules are one thing. The ultimate question is, how would this actually happen? Let's take these rules one by one. What would it require for these things to arise? And most importantly, how likely are each of these steps based on what we know from good old, real, actual hard science? Today, no matter where we look in the tree of life, most cell machinery is made of protein, chains of folded amino acids. When modern cells make proteins, they copy genes from DNA into RNA and then use that RNA as a blueprint for making the proteins. We call this universal pathway the central dogma of biology because it sounds really cool and because it's something that all life shares. But there's a paradox hidden in there, a puzzle. It's a chicken and egg problem. DNA needs proteins to make more of itself, and cells need DNA and the instructions it holds to make proteins. So which came first? We can solve this paradox in a pretty simple way. Just get rid of DNA and protein in the earliest days of life and let RNA do everything. RNA is the molecular cousin of DNA. It contains the same 4-letter alphabet code as DNA, only T is replaced by a similar molecule, U. And instead of 2 strings in a helix, RNA is usually found in just 1 string. RNA is special because in addition to carrying information in that 4-letter code, it can fold up into interesting shapes and actually do stuff. The same way that protein enzymes can do all kinds of chemical reactions, RNA enzymes, called ribozymes, can work life's machinery too. It's now thought that life began in an RNA world. Before DNA became a more permanent form of storage, different RNA chains could have carried information and been the machines for all of life's important chemistry. Unfortunately, the RNA-only world went extinct more than 3 billion years ago. But we can make these RNA enzymes today. Scientists have constructed ribozymes that can copy themselves, just like DNA gets copied. And these copies occasionally have errors or changes, so RNA can evolve too. If you need more proof, you can find it right inside your cells. The ribosome, the massive structure that stitches amino acids into protein, is mostly RNA. We also find nucleotides, the single molecular units of RNA, inside a bunch of other molecules our cells need for metabolism. This all makes sense only if the earliest days of living chemistry were dominated by RNA. And it solves our chicken and egg problem. The RNA world takes care of 2 of our 4 rules: a molecule that can carry information and that can evolve. To find answers for the other 2, we need to ask one more question. Where did life begin? There's been a lot of...
Okay, just to interject here a little bit. There seems to be a little bit of thing where he's saying the RNA is able to change and evolve, just like DNA. The problem is that DNA, in order to change or to evolve or to copy itself, requires a bunch of machines to do the work for it. It does not copy itself at all. It just isn't possible. Just like with a book by itself is not going to copy itself. You need a printer to copy that book. You need a tool. Actually, several, because you also need the computers and the software, as well as the storage devices, etc. So the question is, do they expect RNA to copy itself if DNA can't copy itself without machines? And here's the other thing to consider. All of those proteins and so on, whether it be the RNA or DNA or other molecules, they need energy to work. The energy that is generally used by molecules to do work is ATP. ATP does not exist normally in nature. It's only created generally within cells or within living structures. So that's something to think about. He's talking a pretty good talk there, but let's just listen to him. Let him continue. I want to see what he's going to say next.
Theories about where life came from, but they boil down to these. Either life arose on Earth or life arose somewhere else and was brought here. It's well known that space is full of the chemical building blocks of life, from amino acids to DNA and RNA letters, buried inside meteorites like this one that fell on Australia in 1969. It shows the chemistry that makes biological molecules can happen pretty much anywhere. But the idea that life was delivered to Earth on space rocks, which goes by the awesome name panspermia, there's just no proof it ever happened. And it doesn't really explain the origin of life anyway. It just moves it somewhere else. Life probably started here. No, zoom out a little. Okay. We know early Earth had plenty of chemical ingredients, but the problem with that old idea of primordial soup is that soup can't do anything on its own. Those chemicals can't react without outside energy. We get a hint of where this primordial energy came from by looking, again, at our own cells. Instead of lightning or heat energy, our cells pile up a bunch of hydrogen ions, protons, on one side of a wall, let them flow downhill, and use this like a water wheel to push on cellular machinery and make things like ATP in the mitochondria.
The powerhouse of the cell!
We burn food to keep our hydrogen pump going. But the first life forms wouldn't have been able to do this because tacos hadn't been invented yet. Instead, they would have needed some natural source, and they could have found it at the bottom of the ocean. Deep sea hydrothermal vents are covered in microscopic little pockets, which could have served as molds for the first cells. Molecules with one oily, water-hating end and one water-loving end have this neat habit of forming bubbles and sheets all on their own. And there were plenty of these in the chemical soup near deep sea vents, ready to give rise to the first cell membranes. These vents also create natural streams of hydrogen ions near those little pockets in the rock.
Imagine an early life form sitting there, wrapped in this little membrane bubble, with a free source of energy flowing by, powering all the work it takes to create ordered life and resist entropy. But this would have been the absolute simplest form that life could take. For this life form to become life that looks like what we know today, a lot more stuff had to happen. It had to switch from storing its genetic information in RNA and start using DNA. Instead of using RNA and ribozymes to run all of its cellular machinery, it had to start stitching amino acids into proteins. This opened up new possibilities for making and storing energy that let early life become free-living and more complex. One of these complex life forms is the ancestor of everything alive today, the last universal common ancestor, or LUCA.
This is the end of our journey, searching for the origin of life on Earth. And a lot has happened since. This story is based on things we've actually seen, not just on what's possible. We've figured out when life could have started. We've come up with rules for what life is. We found clues inside our own cells that explain how the first life satisfied these rules and where that life might have started. The only question we haven't answered is why, but that's not really a question for science, is it? There's still quite a few gaps to fill in this story, and if you're looking for a nice, neat answer of how life started, you're probably not gonna find it. Life is just a thing that happens. It's still happening today, and it will evolve and continue as long as there's a place it can happen, on Earth or elsewhere. Darwin didn't know it when he wondered about that warm little pond full of chemicals giving rise to life, but his theory of how things change and adapt turned out to be so powerful, it encompasses life not just in its endless forms, but also in its first ones. Stay curious. Wow, that was a lot. This is probably the deepest story I've ever done on this channel, and it's one that involves some of the science I actually used to do, so this was a lot of fun for me, and I hope you enjoyed it too. But this is only part of the story of how life began. What happened before to make Earth a place where life could happen? And what happened after chemistry became biology? What life form lives at the bottom of our tree of life? For those answers, go check out these videos from our friends at PBS Spacetime and Eons.
Wow. He said a lot of things in there, and there's a lot of different things to reinterpret, I guess, because there's a lot of fluff words in there, a lot of things being said, which, when you look at it, really have nothing more than speculation. So let's see what's going on in the chat real quick here. Let's see. Oxygen kills RNA. Oxygen kills a lot of things. So does water. They tend to destroy a lot of stuff. Bobby, I'm not sure what you're saying is a sus name. So that'll be interesting to find out. RNA needs protection. Yes, that's why they're talking about the oil bubbles in the water, the lipids, the fat bubbles, I should say. Because when the fat molecules are inside the water, they actually form a part where that phases in and a part that phases out, basically forming a spherical shape, which is able to contain a little bit of water on the inside or whatever may be trapped within it, and it's kept separate because it's, like I said, it has a side that likes water and a side that doesn't. But there are some problems with that as well, because quite simply, this little bubble doesn't have a lot of things that a cell membrane would need. It also doesn't have a way to encode this membrane within the RNA or DNA because it's not a part of it. And as we'll find out later on, there's still a whole bunch of other issues with that. But we're trying to learn more on this, so let's see. So one of the things that he had brought up in this one of where did life come from, although he did kind of change that to when, he used the Miller-Urey experiment. So even after 70 years, the scientists are still referencing the Miller-Urey experiment as strong evidence for abiogenesis. Now, he did say in the beginning that it's proof that non-life becomes life very easily. The Miller-Urey experiment created some amino acids. There's no doubt about that. It also created a bunch of tars and other noxious substances which were detrimental. Plus also the amino acids that it made were a race mix, meaning they had both left-handed and right-handed mixes in there. And unfortunately, only one of those is generally used for life. If you put the wrong ones together, you can't. If you put the wrong ones together, it's not going to work. But anyhow, we'll keep going through that. Proven modern things cannot be accepted right now. You're right. How can you call it be proven if it can't be explained? That's kind of like a contradiction. That's a very good point to make. And let's see. It has a bunch of holes in it. Yeah, I would say it does. And as we look at it critically, we can see those holes, especially as we stop looking at only the fluff of when they say, oh, it will keep going from this point to this point to this point to this point. Yeah, it sounds great, but there's no proof. And let's see. Oh, you have to go? Okay, Danzy, you take care. Have a good day. And let's see. The idea that life can come from nothing was destroyed hundreds of years ago. The idea still exists, unfortunately, and is being pushed ever more strongly. I mean, Bill Nye is a very strong proponent of it, as well as, what's the other guy's name? Richard Dawkins. He also is pushing it pretty strong, too. Bill Nye is supposed to be a scientist, isn't he? And there are lots of people who are scientists who still push that evolution, or abiogenesis, I should say, is fully proven. We will cover some of those more in detail later on, at least some of the things that they've been saying. But yes, actual scientists, there are definitely a lot of scientists that push it. So let's see. So as I was saying, they used the Miller-Urey experiment as proof that non-life becomes life easily, and then he says that the experiment isn't how it happened. So we notice that, and it's a bit of a contradiction, isn't it? And I also find it interesting that the narrator changed the question of how life started to the question of when, as I pointed out earlier. I mean, this would be pure conjecture and not relevant to how the life started. But also, if you would notice, the time frame that they have for when life could start was really very short. I mean, they talk about life needing billions of years. But here, they had 2 million years, I think, tops, for their time frame for going from nothing to something. That's not much time in what they need. So it doesn't matter really how long ago life may have started, but only that it did and how did that happen. It's also interesting that the narrator redefines life, but isn't saying life is what living things do. Isn't that a bit of a circular reference? So in other words, to define life, you need to have life to compare it to. Okay, so what makes you knowing that what you're comparing it to is actually life? I mean, if you call a robot alive and it's just sitting there and you put it next to a radio, well, it's able to make sounds just like a robot. Doesn't that mean that it must be alive like a robot? It doesn't make any good sense. It's the circular reference. So you're using pre-existing living things to define life. That's what they're doing. Also, and if you remember, the narrator before said that life creates little closed systems. Wait a minute, hold on. The first video that we watched, the one just before this, said that life was an open system. Isn't that contradictory completely? If he's saying it was open in the first one, and now this guy is saying it's closed for life, and closed systems are the ones that are supposed to follow the entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, we got a problem there. So, I mean, really, how can life be both an open system and a closed system at the same time? It can't. And later, the narrator says that life must have been there at the beginning and is a product of evolution. What? But scientists have been telling us that evolution can't happen until after you have life. So, which came first? The evolution or the life that evolution is using? That's an interesting question to think about it. I mean, I realize they're trying to use some different methods to define life and figure out how things started, but I think they need to check their basic facts a little bit more. They're getting a little bit circular reference again. So, if we take a look at the narrator's new definition for life. Life began the moment that molecules of information started to reproduce and evolve for natural selection. So, do you remember what we looked at before? That little blood cell? It doesn't have information to reproduce in it, and it cannot evolve by natural selection. And so wouldn't that mean your blood cell is not alive? Oh well. Molecules of information. So that's a pretty good mouthful. So not only are they complex molecules, but they must also contain a form of usable information. That by itself is already more complex, way more complex, than the molecules by themselves, especially when you realize information is not based on the media that it is using. Meaning, you can take the exact same material, say a book, you can scribble all over it, and you have no information, but you've got a whole lot of ink on a whole lot of paper. Now, if you instead use that same ink and just print out exact words, same weight, same ink, same paper, but now you have information. But wait a minute. How do we know it's information? Because it has to be usable by something else, able to be read, to be interpreted, and be modified as necessary for its use. So in other words, information all in all by itself is absolutely meaningless if you don't have something that can use it and read it. Sounds like a chicken and egg that works together. So next one, started to reproduce. Like I said, the red blood cell can't reproduce on its own. The process of reproduction is implying not only the reproduction of the molecules, but also the information. So again, like we said, the information is not encoded in the item. It's not actually there. It is an interpretation of what is there. Because really, writing, if you look at ancient hieroglyphic writings, Egyptian writings, I think I can safely say most of us would not understand it at all. We might recognize it as being information, but we certainly couldn't define it, which means it would be completely useless to us. evolve by natural selection. So here evolution is being used to define the start of life, yet are we not usually told that evolution did not exist until after life began? More circular reasoning. And the narrator gave us 4 rules for life. So remember the red blood cell that displayed on the prior video. That cell fails the rules of standing on its own. It would have to be considered as non-living. The narrator is also using RNA to solve the problem of DNA needing proteins. He still doesn't cover how RNA came about in the first place. It also doesn't help that this RNA went extinct and left no imprint of its existence in geologic history, which means it is nothing more than mere conjecture that it even exists in the first place. It just doesn't, there's nothing there. And when you really look at it, the amount of information needed just to make it work is phenomenal, as well as the environment it needs to work, and the extra machines it needs to work, and the ability of having the energy in the proper form to make it work. As we'll see in probably another video, the type of energy really makes a big difference as to something works right or not. Because you can't just say, oh, any energy will work. No. I mean, no. It just doesn't work, period. So yes, the narrator has talked about the energy a cell needs to survive, be able to survive. The cell uses a proton gradient, our ion energy, to power a motor. Where'd that motor come from? The narrator then suggests that deep sea vents could give protocells free protons to use. Except there is a slight issue in that in order to process this energy, the protocell still would need the motor to process the energy. The motor would need to be made first, and this means energy and materials are needed just to make the motor. The cell would also need to have the information to make the motor as well. So this is again some more circular issue of where you need information about how to make the motor, information how to make the machines, as well as having the machines to make the machines and the machines to make the motors, as well as the placement of all this stuff. That's a major issue, don't you think? You talk about having these things that just aren't there. So we've looked at videos from scientists spanning a range of almost 20 years. The expectation is that we would learn how life started from a mix of gas, minerals, and chemicals. What we have learned is that scientists have actually been searching for an answer on how life started for at least 70 years as well. If we start with the Miller-Urey experiment, it's actually been longer than that. We've seen how the scientists have changed ideas on what drives life to be created, but have we seen any real progress in answering this question? So let's consider how all the scientists in these videos agreed. They actually agreed. They don't know how it happened. Now, mind you, that's not what we're taught in schools. It's not what we're taught by media. It's just not taught to us at all. It's just, there. It's just, nope, we don't know. Media says it's a fact. A lot of schools say it's a fact. Colleges say it's a fact. There's a lot of scientists and spokespersons pushing that it's a fact. I haven't seen much to support that thought to say it's a fact. So consider how all the scientists in these videos, okay, I said that already. So wouldn't that put the entire theory of evolution as it's taught in schools and in mainstream media into question for its validity? Doesn't it infer that maybe we might want to look to see what other answers there may be for how life started and what happened beyond that point? Those are other questions you will have to answer for yourself, though, because I cannot tell you how to answer them. I can only give you the evidence and information about the evidence based on worldviews and opinions. It's up to you to decide what sounds more reasonable to you.